Hello, listeners. Hope you are well. I am excited for today's guest. They are somebody who, back when we were doing the Not So Anonymous Alcoholic, we were planning on having on enthusiastic about sobriety and a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, a LADC. Yeah, I'm just stoked that you're here. Thank you, Jessica, for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I'm curious, let's jump right into the sobriety thing. Why did you choose to go into that field?
There's a couple different reasons. So when I first became interested, it was more of the mental health. And I experienced how drugs can affect family members. And then going into high school, experimenting with drugs and alcohol, and also having, I guess, a crazy experience with that, and seeing how my own mental health got impacted by it.
Okay.
And going through those struggles through high school, everyone kind of looked at me differently because they're like, oh, there's that girl, she does this, or oh, she's promiscuous. And then going on to college and sort of dialing that back because I had an interest in mental health, but also still on weekends finding myself drinking like all the time. And so as I dove into it and figured out what
Hold on. Okay, sorry. Let's jump back into there.
Okay.
I had to take a dog break real quick. Now, I'm curious, with kind of what you were describing, were there like identity issues going on when you were younger that a substance kind of made you feel more a part of things? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Actually, I went through some stuff with family that kind of created this sort of wall to where, and not that my family ever didn't make it feel like it was safe, but to where I didn't feel like I could express what was going on. And because my parents, love them both, but they're very different. Like my mom is emotional, which is great. My dad is kind of straightforward, like let's get stuff done. And so I didn't feel like I fit in, but because of what had happened, there was this wall, there was this barrier. And so to cope with that, I went and started hanging out with older people, hanging out with, the cool crowd, as I had thought they were. And then when stuff hit the fan, basically, in my life, I had to really kind of try and balance being this athlete, being in theater, like I enjoyed theater, and then also balance like, wow, this other stuff makes me feel good. But it really wasn't helping what was really going on. And so that's why I think in college, for sure, like where I thought I had everything going on, I was still drinking a lot on the weekends. I was still like using that to feel like I could fit in. Like alcohol made me feel good. And as I continued on with my studies, I realized obviously there's some more shit there, Jessica, that you're not dealing with. And it's like, now that I look back on it, it's like, fuck, what if I would have? Oh, excuse my
language. No. Okay. Dude, fucking go nuts.
But, had I worked on that, I also found myself kind of hitting harder on myself. Like, man, what if I just would have worked on this? What if I really would have advocated for myself? But I could sit in the coulda, shoulda, wouldas all day. So I get what you're saying, and I think there's a little bit of that for sure. Okay. And then there's those experiences and not really having that sense of connection with my parents where I could share that stuff without.
Well, now I'm curious, the way that you're kind of trepidatious in certain things. So was there trauma that happened that like wasn't well received?
Yes.
Okay.
And it was like don't talk about, because it brought brings a lot of stigma. And so it then kind of sat on me of like, oh, did I do something wrong? So I was dealing with that. And that's where, again, sort of the drugs were like, oh, this makes me feel good. People accept me for who I am. Kind of that promiscuous lifestyle. Like, people like this.
Was the trauma something that unfortunately statistically happens to many females?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so kind of working through that on my own as a young child, and then as a teenager, is really hard because you're trying to balance, like, this is what my parents want me to do, but I don't, like, there's a part of me that's missing. And it was like really diving into that trauma and what it was, and that it wasn't my fault. And sometimes parents just aren't ready to talk about it because it's kind of like, oh, if we don't talk about it, it didn't happen. We don't want to like have other people look at it. And
what part of Minnesota did you grow up in?
I grew up in like the St. Cloud Sartell. I went to Sartell.
Okay.
So I even think of just about the community there.
Yeah.
Sartell is one of its own. And I think that's why I definitely stood out too there, because that community lives and breathes. If you are different, then you stick out like a sore thumb. And so you add all that into it.
They're like, why don't you go over to West St. Germain where you belong?
Yeah, exactly. I'm thinking about like the high school reunions, and people are probably going to be like, oh, there's Jessica. Still sticking out like a sore thumb, guys.
Every time I hear Jessica, I think of Rob Schneider in that Freaky Friday-ish movie that he was in. I forget what it was called. But he's a teenage girl. Like, a teenage girl gets in his body, and there's one point where he goes, "It's me, Jessica."
Well, there you go. That was like my entire like high school experience. No.
So, I mean, are your folks a little older?
No. So the biggest thing is I guess it was one of those, the biggest problem is, and I'm probably going to be put on blast if my mom ever watches this podcast. But my mom never told my dad. I actually found out in grad school that my mom never said anything to my dad. So here I am going in elementary and high school thinking that my dad knew all of this. And so there was like this resentment towards my dad because he didn't do anything about it. Like, he didn't ever address it. And that's why, I look back and I'm like, oh, if only I would have talked about this, maybe my dad would have understood why I was kind of reactive or why I was like this. My mom knew, and I think that's why my mom had this sense of more understanding for a lot of the things that I did, like a lot of the reactions that I gave, because I was just angry. I was fucking angry.
Oh, absolutely.
And I could tell, like, looking at it, my mom put up with a lot of the stuff that I did. My dad had like no tolerance for it because he just didn't understand.
Right. Do you think your mom was afraid of what your dad would do had he learned that information? Like, was he a reactionary person? Does that make sense? Like, if he was going to either physically try to do something or legally try to do something?
Yeah. And it all included family. And so the legal aspect I wasn't too concerned about, but I think it was the reactionary. And I think it was just that because of what happened, it meant that it was broken. It meant that the family structure was broken. And I started learning that as I kind of went through understanding mental health and understanding what happens when families go through traumatic experiences. Of oftentimes people don't report things within families because that means we're broken. That means I did something wrong. And I've learned to forgive my parents because, specifically my mom, because her hope was that if we don't talk about it, it didn't happen.
Mm.
And I can't blame my mom for that because she grew up in a small town. And that's justifying some of her stuff. But
I always try to do this. So I open up a lot about like the things that I've been through.
mm-hmm.
And so my brain is always like, come on, I want you to fucking say all the things.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that I do that, I don't want people to feel like, because this still happens where
mm-hmm.
where kids now are still trying to justify the way that their parents acted.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that closes them off to these other support groups.
Yeah.
Because you have to pretend we're going to make it through it.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'll just push it down until I'm out and then I can go and do something else. But like, I have failed my kids as a parent multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, through my addictions, through failing to recognize my own mental health shit. And it hurts a lot for me to think about, what they're going to think of seeing dad get hauled away in an ambulance, or seeing dad, being reckless, and like all of these things. It sucks to think about, but I think that owning that shit means way more.
Mm-hmm.
And will allow, like it allows them to be way more open.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when survivors kind of embellish more on that stuff, allows other people, because the goal with recording this is for people who are listening to not feel so alone and to be able to have this.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big trauma bonding podcast.
Yeah. And it's like one of those things where it's like, okay, I'm going down this route and I'm like, oof, okay, do I save face or do I just let it all out there? And this, like you said, just fucking say it. That is that inner me saying it. And then it's like, it's that justification that I find myself doing of like, oh, I haven't talked to my parents about this. But I also have to own the pieces that part of me. And also I have to forgive the shit that my parents didn't understand. Like you said, like owning that piece about me. And at the end of the day, my parents got to own their shit at
Mm-hmm.
the end of the day. And what I've learned going through all of this is I get to own my part. And my part is talking about this stuff, is working with others, with working, how do we navigate through this? Because there are still going to be people out there that don't talk about their shit.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's that like shitty route of mental health, I think,
Yeah.
like, okay, I went through this. This is my part. They have to own their shit, but I can forgive them for what they didn't understand.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
And like, that's the piece where like, I'm finding that trying to like find that balance while sharing the story is like, okay, here's me. Here's what I went through. Here's kind of my forgiveness towards them. But like, they don't understand. And that's, as a therapist now, when you have kids come through,
mm-hmm.
the kid isn't your client anymore. It's the parents.
Oh, wow.
It's the parents. Oh my gosh. And I was so traumatized in my own world of working with parents, only for the fact that I was scared that I was going to drop an F-bomb. And I did it one time with one of my kids, with one of the parents. And I remember I dropped the F-bomb in front of them and I'm like, oh, that's right. I work with kids, not with adults right now. So yeah, I get it. And it's all about educating the parents now.
Wow.
I listened to your last podcast about certain things that you talk about in the home. And I loved it how she talked about her kids and, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. And I'm like, yes, please. And like you said, you're failing your kids when you're not talking about this. And so looking back on some of that stuff that I was talking about, it's like, that's the shit I don't want to be. I don't want to be like my parents. I don't want to just don't talk about it. If we didn't see it, if we didn't know about it, it's okay. Just wipe it under the rug.
What do you know about? I just heard about this a couple weeks ago,
Mm-hmm.
which is what's it called? Genetic trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So like the fear of airplanes can be common in a family line, and they're researching to see if that's like the way that a mouse, when they see a shadow above, they get anxiety, that fight or flight, and they book it.
Mm-hmm.
Does that same thing happen with us? So like, are the traumas of our parents passed down?
I think absolutely. And I think if I relate back to when I was in grad school and finding out the stuff with my mom, not sharing the stuff with my dad, she opened up more about herself. And she opened up about how her parent, she never told her parents because she didn't want to. And I think that experience carried over into what happened with me. Is, okay, if we don't talk about this, it didn't happen. And because
it seems like the way that you were going about that was in the role of protector.
Mm-hmm.
And it's similar in that regard to what you were saying with what your mom did.
Yeah.
Because really they think that they're protecting. Because if I'm in charge of it, if I have say over it, then I know that they're going to be okay.
Yeah. And that's kind of that piece of where I say, I love my parents, and I kind of, when I talk about it, it's so hard because at the end of the day, my parents haven't talked about it. They haven't worked through it. And so then I want to protect them, right? And so I always try to focus on my piece and what I worked on, because at the end of the day, they either don't want to or they haven't worked through it. And I, unfortunately, as much as I wish I could, I can't make them do it.
Sure.
And so it absolutely, I could see myself as we were talking about it. I'm like, ooh, okay, I just really want to let this out. But I'm like, okay, is it going to be too much for this podcast also? Is it going to be too much? Or, what's going to happen when I go home? And I'm like, yeah, Mama did this podcast.
Did you listen to the episode with Sarah?
Yes. So
I'm glad that was the first episode, because I'll go as deep as whoever the guest is willing to go. Yeah. Exposing all of the gnarly stuff, because it's still taboo in the sense that it makes them uncomfortable as to say man, do I really want to know this about this person? And I wonder sometimes if that, because they're afraid of looking and reflecting on themselves and saying, have I processed the shit that I've been through? And is that why this is making me feel uncomfortable? Because it seems like the people who have accepted what they've been through, they relate really quick, and they go and they want to share and keep on doing the trauma bonding dance. And but for those other people, it seems like there's some things going on within them. There was shit that I found out about my dad when I was in treatment, and I was 32. And finding out that particular situation with him is one of the few things that I won't share about my parents, because it was a trauma that he experienced, but it took this intense thing to happen for him to finally, we can't be any more uncomfortable than being in a treatment facility.
Yeah.
And we're, forced to face these things down. Without going off on too many tangents, when it comes to kind of what you've learned about that that experience with your family, because how old were you when that event had happened?
Well, it actually happened for 4 years.
Fuck.
Yeah, so from 4 to 8. Yeah. And so what I learned about it, because I've worked on both sides of the field, I've been an advocate, and I've also worked with individuals that have assaulted people. Yeah. And, you said you wanted to go deep. So let's,
Yes, please.
we will. It's all about the trauma. And that's what made me so curious about this field. And, right now I have my licensed alcohol and drug counseling, and I'm pursuing my independent licensure for clinical counseling. And you start to see they obviously, chemical dependency, mental health are one and the same. And what I've noticed is it's trauma. And if we don't address the trauma, we're not doing anybody any sort of justice. And then there's all these other pieces that played a role into why people go on to offend, because somebody can experience similar trauma to what I've done, and they can go out and rob a bank or, murder somebody. But I can go on and work in mental health. And so that's why there's all those like little intricate details that go into how'd you get here? Why'd you get here? And that's what drove me into it, is how the fuck did you get here? And that's why when I started going to therapy myself, is how the fuck did I get here? And what are some things that I can do? Because I'm never going to be like somebody who hasn't experienced this. I'm never going to be.
Oh, sure.
There's something that impacted my life. And I learned through that I don't have to be defined by that. And that's a big piece, working on both sides of the, being an advocate and working with offenders, is there's a piece in you that was broken. There was a piece in you that was taken, and it all starts in that developmental, when you're growing up, those attachments. So, yeah, that's what I also learned about myself through it all, is like, what the fuck?
Well, I was going to say two things. First, unfortunately, because I've been on a mental health unit a couple of times, and just in those types of scenarios where I'm having to, address the massive depression in all of these things. There's a huge difference, and I can spot them right away. The textbook professional and the lived experience professional. Because I was on the unit for 5 days before somebody got me to accept that I was an addict. And it was this woman who just came into my room, introduced herself, was super fucking pleasant, and just sat there and like smiling. And I was like, what do we do? And she was like, we talk about whatever you want to talk about. And it was like, okay, so you've gone through some stuff for sure. Because everybody else is like, okay, so where are you on a scale of 1 to 10? And which emoji do you feel most like right now? Are you the smiling poo? Or are you the cry laughing? Like, there's these people that just do a garbage job. Mm-hmm. Like, when I was in treatment, there was a guy that wanted to practice meditation because he had unearthed some trauma that I had gone through and didn't know how to deal with it. So just kind of sent me on my way. And then the next time I saw him, he's like, I want to try this meditation practice. So he turns on some ambient stuff, Enya, and he starts reading off this paper, like the steps. And he's like, breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth. Did you breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth? Good. And as soon as I heard him say good, I was like, he's really reading every single word that's on there. And it totally took me out of being able to relax or anything. So as soon as he's done, I'm like, did it say good on the paper? And he's like, yeah. Like ashamed, like, God. So, I think Kim is somebody who has been through trauma, and that was a big reason for her going into mental health. Mm-hmm. So you either get it, and like, it's like somebody who has seen action in war, and it's either gonna destroy you or it's gonna make you want to go out there and protect other people. Mm-hmm. And I love that about people like yourself, people like him, and the people that have helped me throughout all of the shit that I've been through. So and the other thing, advice for people who have not gotten to where you're at and have experienced that family dynamic. Mm-hmm. Do you have any? I worded that really odd, but do you have any advice for them?
Well, I think the biggest thing is, first and foremost, obviously, if it is your child, get some help, because you're not alone. I think as a parent, we think, oh, nobody else is experiencing this, and our family's broken, or I'm broken, and I'm an awful parent because I didn't see this happening. So first and foremost, you're not, right? You're not the only one. And if you do decide to take that step, get that step for you and also for your child. And when you guys are doing time together in some sessions, really just work on that. It's okay. I hear you. I understand you. Because I think as parents, when we go through that, and we, as I say, like, I have children and I don't.
Well, no, I think the royal we applies. People forget about that. Like, we're all in this together.
Yes. When we're going through that phase, we put on this like guard of, okay, this is broken. That's like the initial thought. This is broken. So therefore, our reaction is to point a finger because it's like a self-protective factor. And the unfortunate piece is it often falls on the child. And so when you're in those sessions, if you make sure it's like that, I hear you, I understand you. How can I support you? What can I do for you? And being okay with also accepting none of what has happened is your fault as a parent. It doesn't mean that you're a bad parent. And then it's how do we go forward from here? Because when stuff happens, we try our best to also fix it, and we can't fix it. Just like addiction, we can't fix anything. And so it's really working together as a unit. And so that's my advice. Get some help. You're not alone. Do what you can for not only your child, but for yourself too. Like, don't forget about yourself.
Oh, it's tough too, because I mean, we live in a society that's so like shame. Like there's this huge movement of people who are trying to denounce shame like altogether. Like, I love the sex worker movement. Mm-hmm. Like those who are in it together, like these people on OnlyFans, there's this like community of people who are helping each other out. It's more than just this whole promiscuous bullshit. Like, they're finding solace in like connecting with other people that are like, why do I need to feel bad about this? So that's kind of an extreme example, but the sentiment is like, there's still a massive layer of shame, because if it gets out that I let something happen to my kid, then it's over. I'm a failure, because the immediate thought on those other parents, it's like when somebody says, if there was a bank robbery, I'd go run straight at the robber. It's like, no, you fucking wouldn't. Like, we're all going to hit the deck.
Yeah.
And I think like similarly as a parent, like you hit the deck because you're like, what do I do? What the fuck do I do? You forget that there's all these other people that are on the ground with you. Mm-hmm. So I completely, we've never had somebody give advice for the parents either. It's usually on the side of the victim, which absolutely needs to be done. But that, you're so right, because that's a huge part. Imagine if your parents had that foresight to know that there were others that they could, reach out to and all that stuff. So similarly with my parents, they were super religious, and in the LDS church, like there's a lot of like, they try to solve things in-house, which is a huge problem when it comes to the LGBT community, when it comes to the opiate epidemic. They did a horrible job. Mm-hmm. Tons of suicide, tons of overdoses, but they don't know what else to do, because this is supposedly what saves their family in the afterlife. So how could it let anybody down? How could it let their own family down? This whole fucking thing. Now, a big reason why I'm super excited that you're here, other than you're wonderfully articulate, is I've tried to talk so much about this. When I was in treatment, I met maybe one person that didn't have some type of underlying mental health issue, whether it be PTSD, anxiety, like a myriad of things. And those played such a huge role in why they were abusing substances. And I'm just recently finding out about addiction centers for addiction that are focused on trauma because it plays such a huge role in most people's lives when it comes to addiction. And if you don't work on what my friend Ryan likes to call work on your mentals, then you're going to continue to struggle because of that shame, and especially because AA is still so prominent, and that whole finding a higher power thing. Not only do you feel ashamed if you relapse for yourself, but now you've let your higher power down, you've let your family down. So there's all these layers of shame rather than the objective stuff, which is you have a massive amount of trauma that you haven't dealt with, and you can't just rely on your higher power to get through that stuff. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. Sorry. So
no, you're like, I'm like smiling from ear to ear because I'm like, yes, it's so true. And I think that's why as a mental health professional, we're all about spirituality. Like, we never want to discredit anybody's spirituality, but we kind of move away from having that be such a heavy focus because people get so like stuck on it. And if there is a lapse, a slip, they feel like, oh, I fucked up. And it's like, no, God will still forgive you, or whoever will still forgive you, whoever you believe in will still forgive you. Like, this doesn't have to be your end all be all. So we have to look at that deeper shit, the deeper roots to all of it, and owning that shit. So
do you remember like when you started to learn about the association between trauma and addiction?
I want to say it's interesting because I feel like I've always known it was a thing, and I think it's, going through those experiences when I was younger, experimenting, using, getting to the point where now there were points in my life where I was relying on it to get through the day. It's all because it came from something else. It came from, I wasn't talking about something else. So I don't know if I can specifically point out when I figured it out, but I always knew it was there. And I was always interested in understanding when we go through life experiences and experiences that change kind of some of our direction, impact our life in a negative way. Why do we sometimes go towards substances, or why do we go towards domestic violence? Like why do we go towards all of these certain things? And then with taking in the things that I have done, incorporating substance use, and now it's incorporating other experiences into that, and really going back to, let's take a look at your brain. Let's take a look at those pathways you've developed. So yeah, long story short, I don't know when, but
that's interesting though, because it seems like, also, if you want to pull down on this guy just a little bit, there you go. It seems like, I think our internal brain goes, well, I know why I used. And so as you're going through these things, that click, because you're just like, yeah, of course. And then you just keep moving forward.
Yeah,
It makes total sense. So I'm sure like that lived experience was like, yeah, of course fucking trauma that.
Yeah. And I think that's why I'm so happy to see the substance use chemical dependency community finally starting to like have LADCs get their, LPCC or like some further education. So you are working at it together. And before they kind of had it, and I think they still do, they kind of had it separated. You went to groups and you talked about substance use, and then you went to certain modules where you learned about mental health, and then you brought it back to your groups. And they've started to have that where they're starting to like bring it together. And I'm, as you kind of shared with your history going through the treatment centers, I wonder, like, curious, how did they have it set up? Were you kind of going and talking about certain things, or did you have like a counselor and then like a therapist?
So I went to Hazelden.
Okay.
And so they had a ton of different, so it got a little confusing because there was a lot of people that had title of counselor.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was not many psychologists.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was like 4,
Mm-hmm.
and they were assigned to the whole
unit.
the whole building, it was crazy. So hundreds of people. Even if it's more than that, then it was maybe 6.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's not a lot. So then they had therapists. So I would see counselor, therapist, psychologist.
Okay.
And then there would be specialists in other fields and stuff. Like, they sent me to a spiritual specialist,
yep.
which was great because that guy, because I was talking about how, I was told that religion wasn't going to be like forced on me
mm-hmm.
when I went in there, but there was day one, immediately religious stuff pushed on me. And then there was a part, because we had to read things every morning. Mm-hmm. And there was a passage that said, are we lost like the atheist, never to be found? And because it's a call and response thing, my whole fucking unit goes, no. And I'm like, fuck.
Yeah.
So they sent me to this spiritual specialist, and I told him that stuff. And he was like, yeah, that sucks. There's not a whole lot we can do about it, but just know. Because even the spiritual counselor was like, yeah, I get it. We do a lot of that, and it's a bummer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the counselor and the therapist, I'm both. So if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why I have the one license and I'm pursuing another one. And so I kind of have basically a specialty in alcohol and drug counseling. And then I have the mental health component. And so I can provide both at one time versus at, Hazelton, or I had worked at Recovery Plus. And they had it, they had the counselor and the therapist, and you'd go to your therapist to talk about your mental health, and you'd go to your counselor to talk about your chemical dependency. At the end of the day, you knew they all kind of intertwined. And so kind of what I've been seeing is, and especially going to grad school, is they're putting it together. They're wanting to see it more together.
Yeah.
And I always thought, and I'm sure you're probably thinking, well, no shit, they go together.
Yeah, I mean, now that you were talking about that, I was thinking about how jarring it is because that facility is so big. Mm-hmm. You had to walk like a mile in each direction to get to the next person, and they'd be like, so yeah, it gets confusing mm-hmm. because then you're going to classes, you're doing all this other shit. So being able to really hone in on one was really difficult. Because mm-hmm. you get a half an hour here, you get a half an hour there, and they say, okay, so I've set up a meeting with so-and-so 3 days from now. Mm-hmm. Whereas with somebody like you can really, because they almost refuse to give any advice on finding, mental health help. They would just say, well, that's what Rebecca deals with, so let's focus on this right now. And it's like, well, yeah, but the thing that drove me absolutely crazy at Hazelden was there was this lady who, which I can't help but have a bias towards people like this, but So she, for some reason, says how she flies from New York to Hazelden because she lives in New York, but she makes so much money that she continues to work at Hazelden. So she'll stay there for 3 or 4 days and then fly back home. So you're like, okay, so clearly this is going well for you. And then she would talk about the big book and all of that stuff. And she would say, what's the definition of insanity? Mm-hmm. Which is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And then she would have people raise their hand, like, how many of you have relapsed? And they would like all raise their hands. And it was like, all you're doing actually is pointing out that you guys are failing, especially if they were like, how many people have been here before? Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, you got to switch something up then. You can't point this thing out and say 5%, only 5% of people can make it out without relapsing. And I know that statistic fluctuates all the time, but it's like, fuck, man. If it's been going on like this for decades, then do something different. Mm-hmm. There's got to be a different way to approach this. And the massive thing that they keep sweeping under the rug is the mental health stuff.
Yeah.
They talk about all of this enlightenment and like, if you're going to have some guy like play with bowls on stage and, talk about putting magnets on your aura and shit, like, why not talk about the actual objective mental health stuff so that people can get through this?
Yeah.
So, again, biased because it fucking infuriates me, but
I know it must be rough. No. Like that's I'm totally the same way. Like I guess I don't even know what to say to that, but hey.
Well, so I guess from what you see in the people, so did you work with adults dealing with addiction initially, or?
Yes, so I worked primarily with women and men, and then I transitioned to Moose Lake, and I work in a secured environment now, and I just work with men there. But I also work private practice, and I told my boss, I was like, please give me kids, even though I'm like, again, nervous, scared to work with kids because I knew what it meant.
Oh, I thought you wanted him to give you children. Like.
Oh, no. No, like clients, please let me have clients as kids. But I was like scared because I knew what came with that. That meant the parents were going to be my clients. And I, again, am going to drop an F-bomb the first session, and I did. But nonetheless, I wanted to have that experience because of the fact that a lot of the adults that I've worked with, their mentality is like kids. And how do I kind of, through the eyes of a kid, like, how do I apply that to adults then too? And so I've had a, interesting array of, clientele, I guess, but definitely started off with adults because I strictly was like, I will not work with kids because that means I have to deal with parents, and I don't want to deal with parents. But we are adjusting. We are all adjusting. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's interesting because conveying the, concerns of the child to the parent, when you hear that stuff, it feels like an affront on you as a parent. Mm-hmm. So that's got to be insanely difficult to have them be non-confrontational and not, question your motives. Like, are you saying I'm a shit parent, or like that I did something wrong? Mm-hmm. I've dealt with that just doing photography, like because I grew up around kids. So when kids are being kids and like running around and not wanting to sit still, it's like, just let it happen. It's fine. Mm-hmm. And they're like, well, no, they need to just listen to me. And it's like, all right, I'm not trying to fight you on being a parent. I'm just letting you know that kids are a 5-year-old is not going to want to sit and do 10 different poses in a row.
Yeah.
So, for you, the youngest person that I met that was an addict was this 18-year-old kid from Kansas. And he said that he started using when he was 13. Mm-hmm. How I don't know how you help somebody like who their brain is still developing get out of addiction. Like, it seems so difficult. So, I mean, how do you switch up your tactics to try and help a child versus helping an adult? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. What I've noticed is it's also it's one and the same, because some studies have shown that when you are younger and you start using, that's where your kind of brain starts to slow down in developing. And so oftentimes if I have an adult that started using at 13 and didn't have a length of sobriety, I mean, they're still technically 13 and they could be 36. And so with I use similar styles with kids. And I talk a lot about, this is where like the fun part comes in with working with kids. And I also apply it with adults. I talk about Harry Potter quite frequently. Yes, I have to drop it in there. We are at that point now. I use a lot of those references because kids know Harry Potter. Some adults have shocked me and they don't know. Some kids have too.
It's disgusting.
I know. I'm like, breaking my heart.
Do you not have a wand at home?
Yes. So let's go through the Sorting Hat online and let's find out what house you're in. But, that's with kids. It's more so just kind of spicing it up a little. You're still using the same like DBT skills, those distress tolerance. And really with kids, it also is hard because culturally, socially, whatever, when they get 21, it's supposed to be fine. Or when they go to college, it's just supposed to be cool. And so also with kids, I've noticed just being a little bit more selfish to them, like going to their needs. Because as a developing mind at that age, we didn't really care about anybody but ourselves.
Yeah.
And so kind of talking about, all right, so if you do this, like what are some of the impacts it can have on you? And, not the scared straight method, but almost kind of similar to like a little bit of that scared straight of like, hey, so if you continue to do this, what could happen? And what you want to do all these things, finding some of their goals, like if they want to go to college, if they want to go and be like a pilot, it's like, okay, so how could your addiction help you there? How could it hinder you there? Really weighing out those pros and cons, while adding a little bit of Harry Potter, but adding a little bit of spice to it, I would say. Harm reduction, that's a big thing. And I know that's a big thing even with adults too.
Yeah. So obviously there's still a lot that I'm learning, only, like 1 year basically of really diving into this stuff. When it comes to harm reduction, it seems like there's kind of this lingering, like, I don't know, like uncertainty about harm reduction. Does it seem effective, or is this another thing that you kind of like going to do dialysis? Like, is it similar in that sense where they're going to have to do it potentially for a really prolonged time?
Yeah.
Am I understanding it correctly? Well,
yeah. I mean, that's a good point. The only reason I'm kind of thinking is like, I never really thought about it that way. I always love learning new ways to kind of bring things in so other people can understand. So I'm like, that's a good one. But I initially, because we know with addiction, it has to start with you wanting to do it. And you have to believe that you can do it. And I think with harm reduction, it allows the person to not, like if they experience a slip, it's not an end all be all. So I think of individuals that have used heroin, and so then they go to maybe like methadone or Suboxone. So there's the harm reduction that way. I think of an alcoholic, And if they were to like just quit drinking the next day, could that be more harmful to their body? And it opens that gate also to talk about this. Like, hey, Jessica, I had a beer today. Okay. So you started off with 5. Now you're at 1. Okay. And they can do it for long periods of time. Or we can work on getting to the point where they're not using at all. So that's how I've taken that approach. Some people are like, no, abstinence is key. And I totally respect that. And I totally understand that. However, sometimes it's not for everyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the lovely thing about addiction and mental health is not one size fits all.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, another thing that I've been finding in like the people that I've interviewed and so many addicts that I've talked to, it fascinates me. I know how my addiction works, which is whatever the substance, my brain is going to go. It's like hearing a new song. Let's play it on repeat for a fucking week.
mm-hmm.
Like I just will overkill it.
Yeah.
And I know that. But with other people, like finding out that alcohol was their vice and they can smoke weed and it does not affect them in the same way. I still haven't figured out how does that work? Like, how are you introducing dopamine in basically the same way, but it doesn't make you want to overuse it or use it as an escape in the way that you used alcohol or heroin or whatever the fuck. Like, it just boggles my mind that people are able. Like, have you met people who have gone that kind of route?
Yeah. And, actually, when I stopped using, because my vice was the pain meds, and I went to alcohol, and at the time in my life I thought, oh, this is better. But then recognizing, if I'm with the right people, if I'm in the right spot, I will just hang out with alcohol all weekend long. But then with marijuana, it doesn't create that similar experience. Like I can be fine. And I almost think it is, I haven't really like dove into this myself, but I question if it's the fact that some of that stuff is like man-made. And then I think of like the natural stuff, but that's a whole nother thing too.
Yeah.
And I also think of, it's also where you're at too. And, alcohol is a depressant, and, you have the stimulants, they're the stimulants too. So I've seen people that have used meth and they're fine with alcohol just because they're on 2 different sides of the spectrum. So I don't like truly know what it is, but what I do work on with people that do that is, okay, what's kind of the intake look like? Why are you using it? When are you using it? Because if it gets to the point where they're using it to cope,
right,
or, they're getting to the point where like that's all they're doing, like that's their pick me up, then it's, okay, this is no longer something that's suiting you. And really just being mindful of, are they addressing that underlying stuff, that underlying shit? So.
I have this theory, and I've said it many, many times, but when it comes to the way that your brain functions on like a base level, like those passive survival skills, breathing, blinking, stuff like that, and because the brain remembers really, really, really good things and really, really bad things, when there's these microaggressions to the brain and it associates dopamine with survival. Like when somebody says, I had a shit day at work, I'm going to have a beer. You're doing these micro things that are training your brain to say, okay, when the bad thing comes, we introduce this because the dopamine lets our body know that we're surviving. We're okay right now. And so when people think of like, yeah, I could stop drinking, but why would I? I wonder if there's that thing in the back of their head that's like, it helps me survive in these micro aggressions. Does that make sense? And so I always tell people like, because people will ask me what addiction looks like, because I was like the first full blown addict in a lot of people's lives, and so they question their own use and like, does it make me an addict because I do this? I question, is the substance for getting through something, or are you just using it because it's there? And then, like, how do you feel about it when you think about it not being there?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, like, do you dive into that, like the whole midbrain and that 3-step process and all that fun stuff?
Yes. And so what you're hitting on is a lot of those beginning questions that people have, and a lot of reasons why some people are like, oh, it's really not that bad because Joe Schmo over here is doing like way more things than I am. And it's like, oh, oh, just because you're an alcoholic does not mean that you're better than the heroin addict, you know?
Yes.
So, and so we talk a lot about, I'm a big, like, I'm a newbie, but I'm also excited, or I get really excited about those pathways in the brain. Like when you're talking about the brain, I'm like, yes. Because I think about those pathways that we've developed. And when you're talking about the alcohol and going to the alcohol to help you get through the day, that's that. And what I use is that's that pathway. That's that way that we have learned that's normal. That's natural for us. That's our survival technique. And so then I say what's really cool about pathways is like you get to create your own pathway. And it fucking sucks to have to do that. Yeah. Oh my God. I remember having to do that myself. But sometimes we have to put a light to our old pathway. So I talk about the things that we can do in the here and now that can create some type of light to get us through creating that new way, that new road. And we talk a little bit about what the effects can have on your brain, and if you continue to do this, what it can look like. And primarily we do that with, like, I do that with my, like young adults, teenagers. I don't really primarily do that with the adults, like talk about the effects. It's really about, at that point, talking about the underlying stuff, because
well, adults, we go, it's so weird because we accept death and like all these negative things on a weird level.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, people who smoke cigarettes, what is it? Depending on when you start, it can take 25 years for you to stop smoking, which is asinine. It's fucking crazy. But it's because we're like, yeah, we know it's bad for us because we know of all the other bad things. Like, I eat McDonald's and that could kill me. I do this and that. So it's like, what's one more thing that could kill me? It makes me feel this way. So who fucking cares? Mm-hmm. So I get what you're saying. Like, because so many people relapse, obviously the consequences have gone by the wayside. Mm-hmm. And not necessarily that they are saying fuck the consequences, but on a subconscious level, we've just been conditioned and we've learned about all the horrible things. So what's it matter in the end?
Yeah, exactly. And it's almost like why go through, it kind of reminds me, if I was an adult sitting in a room and I heard about the effects, I'd almost think of like the DARE program. I know. It works so well. Oh, the DARE program. It worked really well, right? And that's what I would think about. And I get there's reasons for it. And I understand why maybe you might bring it up for educational purposes. But it's like, okay, you know certain things. But I am not a medical professional. So I don't want to hit too much on this. But I do know a little bit about trauma. I do know a little bit about some tools and some tips for what you can do to not do that stuff. So let's focus on that, because that'll take up a lot of our time.
Yeah.
The other stuff.
As a therapist, I'm curious if you've use this tactic because I just heard it on Sunday. My friend that was going to therapy, because he was having trouble communicating with his wife. He wanted to, rather than going to substances, he plays video games if he's had a bad day at work. So he goes, and that's how he decompresses. But he wasn't conveying that to his wife. She would want to interact, and he'd be like, no, I need to just... So he would say, like, he'd get like this blind aggression where he's being shitty, but it's because he doesn't know how to vocalize, like, I need some time to get these thoughts out of my head, you know, or whatever. Do you mind if I go and play video games? And the therapist was like, what's the negative, like, aspect of you asking, of you saying that? And he was like, there isn't one. That's why we're married, is because she's so understanding. So he was like, oh. So when you think of things like in the, rather than like the negative aspects of if you keep using, what's the negative if you stop using? Mm-hmm. Like, have you implemented that?
Yeah. So, like, kind of my starting thing is looking at the pros of the continued use and the pros of not continuing to use, and then the cons of continuing to use, and then the cons of not doing that. To really kind of have them look at, okay, if I do this, like, what are the pros of me doing this? Because oftentimes we don't really focus heavily on, like, the pros of using.
Right.
But it is good to at least look at it and understand just a smidge as to why you do it. Because there's a reason. There's some type of pro to it. But then it's looking at kind of, then they start to look at, oh, wait, hold on a second. There's a lot more cons than there are pros. And so why am I doing this? It opens that door. And I think sometimes when we ask the question or we don't ask the question, it's that kind of fear of, like, what could be the answer? And I think that's why when we are in our active addiction, we don't ask those questions, because it's like, oh, that means I have to, like, look at it. Mm-hmm. And we don't ever want to look at it when we're in our active addiction. We just want to keep the party going. We want to keep just kind of avoiding whatever we wanted to talk about because we want to feel good in that moment.
Yeah. I'm finally able to start talking about this because I don't work there anymore. But I absolutely hated my job. And the only way that, and this was an excuse that my brain was making to use more than usual. Because I was so high functioning when I was using, searching for the negatives was, like, impossible for me. It felt impossible. And so when it was addressed that, like, I should cut back on drinking and at least try to stop drinking, I was like, okay. Lasted a week, and then I was like, this is dumb. I don't understand why. So I started using it at work because I was so high functioning that nobody knew, nobody could tell. And I got a promotion. So the weekend, the Friday before I attempted suicide. So it was, I'm pretty sure it was a Friday. And then that Saturday is when I attempted. So I had confronted my supervisor and the general manager, and I was like, this shit is not going the way that it should. You guys know that it's not. Let's meet on Monday. So me, as, like, just a nobody, felt so confident that I could go to these guys, and they believed me. They were like, so being so good at being an addict, which is dangerous as fuck. Like, when people say they were high functioning alcoholics or high functioning users, it's like, that's so bad, because your brain is, like, utilizing these aspects so that you don't question using. Mm-hmm. You're like, okay, so if we don't slur, let's focus our attention on articulating, which was a huge thing for me. I would never slur. I would never be weird. Like, it was highly articulating, yada, yada, yada. So, like, that fascinates me too. Like, your brain finding the ways to make it appear that you're not doing all of this. Like, that there's no to secure that there's absolutely no reason for you not to be using.
Mm-hmm.
Because on the baseline, your midbrain is like, we gotta survive, and all this dopamine that's coming means we're surviving. So fucking figure it out, guys.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I get that frustration, and like it literally feels like, to me, it felt like this cavern. Like when somebody would say, "Well, what's the why?" Because there were people that were like, "Why is Kim telling you not to drink anymore?"
Mm-hmm.
I was like, "I don't know."
Mm-hmm.
It felt like there was nothing there for me to complain about or say why I was doing these bad things, or that I was doing anything bad.
Mm-hmm.
But that was also like never really pointed out in treatment, that way that you do the pro. So when you said I do pro and then con,
Mm-hmm.
it was always pros versus cons, like the stereotypical way, which as an adult, your brain goes, oh, I've seen this before.
Yeah.
I already know. I forget what that tactic is called, but like, I guess it's kind of a forced response.
Yeah, it's like basic. I almost think about it as like the shame. Like it's like, oh, the pros of, like if you just have it as a pro con thing, I always think of like, yeah, because you know that using drugs it's not good for you. You know, using alcohol and copious amounts is not good for you. So let's only look at the one side. You know, like, oh, thanks, asshole. You know.
Yeah, exactly. We're all like, we all, or a lot of us drove ourselves here.
Mm-hmm.
We get it.
Yeah.
We know how to figure out the puzzle that you're presenting for us, and all that shiatsus.
Mm-hmm.
So the pro list. Oh, I'm sorry. So I kind of went off track there, but it made me go back to that whole, what's the negative of you looking for the positive, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I wish that was done more often, because I didn't really see that in this,
Mm-hmm.
what is supposedly like this high grade recovery facility,
Mm-hmm.
which really is like just a blown up timeshare model, because they do this pitch at the end. They give you this fancy dinner, and the other fucked up thing, they use like champagne bottles to pour orange juice in, and it's like, guys, what are we doing here? And they give you this packet on like, if you relapse, and there's this option and these marvelous facilities, and they're like advertising it. It's like, I don't want to come back here.
Mm-hmm.
You should be saying like, here's phone numbers to call, and like, here's resources, rather than give me this weird ass pitch.
Yeah, and I use the Hazelden products, but I've never gone there, and I've heard similar experiences. It's almost like how I always thought Hazelden was like, oh shit, I don't have enough money to go, and
first person I met was this millionaire who was paying his own way. It was $47,000 for him to be there.
Yeah, and it's crazy. And so I use their material, but I've never gone there. And so to hear you share like, oh yeah, it was like this pitch afterwards, and then to like hear they're using champagne bottles to pour orange juice, I'm almost like, oh, are you trying to get us to come back here? Like, I'm seeing like all these red flags, and
I'm not saying that there weren't amazing resources.
Yes.
Absolutely, there are.
Mm-hmm.
But I just wish. I get that, like, I'm an atheist, so people always take what I say with like a grain of salt, because I'm geared that way. But if you believe in God, God's still going to exist if you don't use him. Like, you don't use him when you're, making a pie.
Mm-hmm.
You're not like praying to make sure that all the ingredients go in there. Like,
well, sometimes I am, but but no.
But you know what I mean? Like, you're using the instructions. Yeah. God is still going to exist whether there's instructions there or not. Just pretend. Actually, you don't even have to pretend. You could just say, if God works in mysterious ways, he put these tools in front of me so that, I don't have to pray for every single answer to get to the end result. Like, God doesn't need to be in the science lab. God doesn't need to be in the treatment facility, because you can just pretend that he put it there for you, and you can just utilize what's there. because there's so much shame associated with letting God down if you relapse. And I mean, 3 people have already died from my unit, and they were heavily religious. And I question whether or not that played a role in like why they didn't seek help the next time, is they were just like, well, I let God down for the last time. I'm fucking ending this.
Mm-hmm. And that's the unfortunate thing that I think just in general, a lot of places are missing is that shame component. I think they're starting to open up and talk about that, but I don't
think they think of the consequence of the potential shame that's associated with what they're going to introduce.
Yes.
Which I wish they would think more about. Like, what is the potential shame that, like, how could they twist it? Because addicts, we're geared to try and twist shit into our favor so that we can use again.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to, somebody has to think like, okay, so in their brain, because most of us after treatment, we go and we hyperfixate on something else, exercise, religion, all of these other things, because we're like, we fucking made it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And now I'm going to do this. Not realizing exactly we're keeping that thing active.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I wonder why they can recognize these things, like they know that there's cross addiction. They know that there's these other things, but that shame component is so heavy.
Mm-hmm. And it's almost like we all know it's there. It's just we don't take the time to talk about it because shame is such an icky it's an icky feeling. And so when we talk about it, that means we kind of have to sit in the shame. And it's such an interesting thing because I work with clients that there is shame in it. And previously, shame-based therapy was a big thing. Like, I'm going to shame this out of you. Just like, addiction. Like, I'm going to shame this out of you. And I think now that we've started and we have moved away from shame-based therapy, you still kind of have some of that philosophy floating around. And they're not taking the time to really like look at like, where is this coming from? And taking the time of like, how does that make you feel? Because it's coming together. Like I said, the counselor therapist role, they're coming together, but I think because they're kind of separated, they're missing talking more about the shame because it's almost like, well, they talk about it. No, they talk about it.
Oh yeah. Yes. 100%. Like I was saying before when the counselor was like, well, that's more Steven's thing. So go on.
Yeah. And it's like, no, damn it. I don't want to talk to Steven. I want to talk to you.
Yeah. Because when people form connections, like when you're in a facility filled with strangers and you're supposed to be opening up to somebody, if you make a connection, like, I mean, there was one counselor who had been through addiction. So there's a lot of people that leaned on him, but he would have to say, because of like protocol and whatnot, like, I can give you as much as I can give you, but then you got to go and bring it to this person. Mm-hmm. Whereas, and that's a problem in mental health too. Like you can't hug, you can't do these things that like, especially in the Midwest that we're so like prone to do, rub somebody on their back and like do shit like that. Like there are these things that like these gaps where we can't fill them in, even though we really want to. Mm-hmm. But I think like the theoretical side of these things, like there's theology behind everything. I know that theologians, it's normally like a religion thing, but I think the theoretical concept, like you have to do those what ifs for almost everything. Mm-hmm. If you're trying to save someone's life, I feel like it shouldn't be a waste of time for somebody to say, well, what if, I mean, like if we tell them that God is always going to be there, right? And he's always willing to take you back. I mean, do we think about, because of the eternal concept behind God, if somebody twists that and says, I've let them down eternally. I haven't just let like my dad down who, I could create a father figure. I could create another father figure and survive. But letting the thing down that like is in charge of everything, mm-hmm. it means I've failed completely. Mm-hmm. And that can destroy their motivation to try and stay sober or to try and seek more help and all those things. You can still believe in God, people. It's okay to use the other stuff. That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry.
Yeah, but no, yeah, totally. And I use that saying of like, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Yes.
You know, don't put all your faith into God. Don't put your sobriety on God. Because I think imagine if you put it on just on one person. Like, let's just make God a person. Imagine if you put all of your sobriety on one person. Why would you ever put it on another person? Why not put it on yourself? Because you have that power to do things. You can control yourself. You can't control another person. And so, yeah, the bottom line is yes. You know, that's always those moments that come to mind when I hear others say those similar things that I'm thinking and I'm sharing with others, is that yes moment. Because don't put all your eggs in one basket.
It's like that. Like, have you watched Pleasure Unwoven?
No, I haven't.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God. So it's the lamest movie ever created. It's so dumb.
I can't wait to watch it.
Like, because the guy who did it, it's a doctor who became an addict, and he wanted to know more because of the technicality that on how disease works. So what is a disease? And he's like, well, so his problem-solving brain got fixated on that. And he started to think, okay, well, so how do we really make sure that this is or should be classified as a disease? And so he's the guy that kind of created it's a disease of choice. You chose to do it in the first place, but you didn't have any choice as to what it was going to do to you afterwards, how it was going to take hold of you. So his whole thing is the objective aspect of it. And when I saw that, like, what appeared to everybody else as this really boring shit, it's this super simple thing that he said, that 3-step program, how your midbrain eventually needs that dopamine so bad that you skip over step 2 and go straight to action, right? So it's the base thing. Body's like, we need dopamine. And then step 2 is supposed to go, all right, so how do we get dopamine? And then step 3 is, okay, let's go get dopamine. Yeah. When you're heavy in addiction, your brain goes, okay, we fucking cannot think about it. We need to just go get it. Yeah. Learning that thing made addiction look like this snow globe on a shelf now. I was like, oh, there are aspects of, I can blink longer if I want to, but on a subconscious level, when I'm talking to somebody, I'm not really controlling my blinking or my breathing, really. And it's the same thing. Like, there's this subconscious aspect of myself that doesn't know what the alcohol is. It just knows what the dopamine is. And so I was like, wow, that and then I was like, I don't need a higher power. I need, like, to recognize all of how insanely lucky I am. 1, that I got to hear that little bit of information. 2, the support system that I have. And I was like, holy shit, everything just opened up and decomplicated a lot of things and allowed me, while I was at Hazelden the rest of the time, to do all that theoretical shit and helping other people is this is another funny thing, is like finding out that I have hypomania and codependency issues. And the codependency part of me, I always associated it with couples. I didn't realize it was something that just applies to thinking that for some reason I'm the one that needs to help the thing, because they're not going to be able to do it. They don't fucking understand. So I'm the one that has to inject myself into this situation. And I did that a lot while I was at the facility, because it was like, I know what their job is. And even though I learned that I was codependent, I was like, you know what? Everybody has flaws. I'm okay with this one. If my codependency issues help 5 people, rad, whatever. As long as I'm not letting it take me over, then who gives a shit? Yeah. Some people have Tourette's. Some people are on the spectrum. I have codependency issues, whatever.
And it's and you're using it though. Like I think what's so good is like you recognize it and you're using it for the good, because before you knew about it, or maybe when you did know about it, whatever, maybe, long story short.
Before it was like a self-righteous thing.
Okay. Yes.
So that's when it was a problem. It was like
Yes.
these dumb Facebook posts, these arguments that didn't need to happen because internally I knew I was right.
Yes.
So then when I realized it was a codependency issue, it was like, oh, it's not that I know that I'm right. I'm just, my chemical imbalance wires me to think that I have the knowledge with which is going to save this person.
Yes.
And really, I just have lived experience that could potentially help in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
So turning it from this white knight thing into like, I've been through the shit, man, and I could let the professionals do it, but I can't help myself. Mm-hmm. My codependency makes me want to reach out to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're using it, and you can use those things for like better. Like I think of also people with high psychopathy, or people that are anti.
What's that?
So like psychopathy is where you think of certain. I'll use just one person in particular. I think of like our most recent president.
Oh sure.
Yeah. And
is that what turns your skin orange?
I think so. No, part of it. But it has kind of like that lack of regard for others, has kind of doesn't care about it, lack of empathy. And, you know, there's people that can be successful with it. I mean, if you want to call Orange Man successful. And then there's people out there that like can be like a Ted Bundy, you know, they can.
Would Trump's situation be like an example of like enabling that psychopathy? Does that make sense? Like,
yeah.
Or indulging in it? Yeah.
I think part of me wonders, like, if he just didn't have a social media account, like, could there be decent qualities about him? Because, like, the social media thing just threw me for
Kanye West is similar in that they've achieved success. So people, rather than questioning, they go, well, it's worked out so far.
Yeah.
So we should maybe take note to the stuff that he's saying, which I feel like is similar with Trump. They were like, well, he's made it this far.
Yeah. And it's like some of these other things, like people would just kind of be like, oh, just don't look at this. So that's why I'm like, I wonder if social media, like if he didn't, could he? But nonetheless, he had different views than I do. So, but the real aspect of what I was trying to get at, right, before I went off, is you can use it for the good or you can use it for the bad. And so myself, I am like the savior. I want to be the savior. Like all my clients, I get into those modes where if my wand did work, you know, I would just wave it and they would be fine. And I had to say, wait a second, I can't do that. Like I can't fix you, even though I really want to. And so I use those learned experiences, those lived real life experiences to kind of show them that like I am human too, and I'm here to help you, and create kind of that platform. So I'm using that stuff for the good versus somebody who's maybe gone through the same shit as I have could use it for the bad. So yeah. So when I heard you say that, I'm like, yes, you're using it for the good. Like use that stuff. It's okay. And I think that I kind of mentioned that shame therapy, it wanted to get rid of that stuff. It wanted to say that stuff is bad. And it's like, no, that stuff isn't bad. It's just, it is like way more present right now because it's helped us survive, you know? And, and so let's take some of those things that helped us survive and let's kind of even keel it. So it's not like self-sacrifice all the time, 24/7, right? But let's kind of self-sacrifice and use them because you clearly made it, right?
Well, barely. That's
but you made it. I always tell people you made it so far, right? How you got here, we'll work on that. But you got here, so let's use some of those tools that you got here, and let's just fine tune them. You know, let's just fine tune them a little, not change your whole platform.
I got you. Yeah. I mean, that's like, Well, so one thing that like I find lucky, like about like I was saying with the snow globe on the shelf thing. There's I say this all the fucking time, but there's this guy from Monty Python. His name's John Cleese.
Mm-hmm.
He was in Harry Potter. Actually, he's the headless ghost.
Yes, I was like, God, that name sounds familiar. Because to be honest, I've only seen like certain clips of Monty Python, but I was like, that name, yes.
Yeah, he's a wonderful human being. So he, because somebody had asked him about Fox News, like why it is that they're able to continue doing the same thing that they've been doing and somehow don't see a problem with it. And John Cleese was talking about this book that he read where the author said, stupid people lack the capacity to recognize that they're stupid. And when I heard that, I was like, I mean, really what that's saying is if you're too deep like too deep or too involved in a thing, you lack the capacity to see the issues that are with it. Like for me, I was so deep in my addiction that I lacked the capacity to recognize the problems that were with it. So with people like Trump, when he has all of these positive affirmations that are coming his way, he lacked the capacity to even recognize that there was a problem with it because he'd have 70 years worth of this, these words of affirmation his whole life. Even though he was doing shitty things, it allowed him to justify those things because he still had all of these people doing that stuff. So like when you lack the capacity to recognize that, so how do we plug somebody out of the matrix, right? How do we get them to see the reality of things? And that, so there's these little things that help me go, oh, I lack so the big step for when I agreed to go to treatment was I don't want to go to treatment, but I don't want to be sober, but I want the desire to want to be sober. So most addicts, we're never going to be like, oh yeah, I want to be sober and get rid of this shit that I fucking love.
Yeah.
But taking it one step back and going, oh, wouldn't it be nice to want that though? Or what does that look like? So saying I would like the desire to want to do that thing. It's like when people say I'd love to learn the guitar, but really they're like, I don't want to spend all that time learning chords and shit. That's super annoying. Just looking for the desire to want to know more. Or looking for the desire to understand it. Desire, purpose, and survival, I found, are like the three basic things that are huge in going through sobriety.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. And my biggest thing is going from survival to thriving. And so.
Surthrival.
Yes, surthrival. Woo. I like that. I'm going to coin that one. I'm going to TM that real quick, trademark it. And so like using those skills that we had during that surviving stage and getting them to the point where we can now be thriving. And thriving is finding that purpose and that drive and really working on getting there. And it's not some straight line. It's like go up here and then, oh wait, we got to take a detour. We got to go back and then we go here. And then we do a loop-de-loop and just.
Well, and that thriving there's like, having that motivation and all of that stuff and the driving force and the purpose and making sure that there's a positive feeling towards doing that shit. Because there's some people that just, I'm going to be a lawyer, so I'm going to push myself and do all this shit, even though I get my degree and now I fucking hate it and I'm going to be a hairdresser instead. Like you could thrive into something that you hate, but so like it's perceived thriving.
Yes.
It's having that positive aspect of it, which I feel like people like you help enable individuals to find. Like pushing yourself doesn't mean that you're putting yourself through torture. There's this like rainbow that's going to follow you into getting there.
Yeah, exactly. And it's why I enjoy what I do. And there's some days where I'm just like, fuck, why did I do this again? I'll go home and thankfully my significant other loves psychology as much as I do.
Oh,
so,
nice.
Yeah, it's really awesome, but annoying at the same time.
Dude, I was just thinking, Kim and I, it's so funny when like she'll catch herself being like really angry and like wanting to get into this big argument. And I'll go, well, how does that make you feel? Like, what does this look like? And I'll do the thing that we love. And she's like, fucking no, I just want you to be angry right now.
Yep.
And it's so, yeah, I relate to that big time.
Yeah. And it's like, no, just let me have my moment of angry. But then when it's so amazing to see that like light up when we get really into a conversation. Like yesterday, I was talking with him about all these things that had happened at work, and I was like, I was really angry, but then this other person like called him out on it, and then, oh my God, like he's making so much progress. And so it's a good thing. And then, like I said, it's that annoying thing, right?
Yes.
Because then your partner can be like, so how does that make you feel? And it's like, don't therapize me right now. Go away. No.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I'm vaping, right? Mm-hmm. I know I'm an addict. I know what this does to that pathway. Mm-hmm. But just like the accepting my codependency issues, I go, yeah, I mean, I get it. I know the dangers of it. I know exactly what all of this shit means. But it's the ritual. I can't help it. Yeah. So like I go down to like I'm about to buy, my friend showed me there's these pens that it's basically like essential oils. Like there's no nicotine in them, and it really, you're just breathing in steam. Like, but because the addicts, that ritual aspect of it, like I became addicted to cigarettes because all of the good ideas in treatment were happening out in the smoking pit.
I was going to say all those good things, finding yourself always happens down in Smoker's Lane. Right?
Yeah. Which is super funny. So even though I'm making all of this progress, I'm like, I'm not perfect. This is not going to be like, I mean, I'm wearing Crocs with black socks. There's some problems.
But nothing's, like you said, nothing's going to be perfect. And I totally get that too. Is like, there's some things that you're just like, oh, I'm not quite ready to like let go of, or it's the ritual. And I think it's that awareness that you have now, before, during your addiction, or before understanding about codependency, or before understanding how our trauma experienced us. We didn't know. We weren't aware of all of this stuff. But now we are. And so like, I still smoke cigarettes. I know the effects of it. And I know that like, oh, if I do this, could it potentially lead to this and stuff like that. But it's like, no, it's a cigarette, or it's a vape. It doesn't have to be more than this. Because I'm aware of it. I get to own that. I get to control that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And what's the thing that I like realized, cause at one point I was absolutely vaping my ass off. Not that it's slowed down a ton more than then, but like when I was using Juuls, I was like, oh my God, this is so much better for me. So I can just go nuts.
Yeah.
We were in Florida and I had ran out of Juuls and there were no gas stations nearby. And I was getting like edgy and it wasn't until I got one and took that first inhale that I like cheered up and I was like, oh, okay. So now we have a problem. Mm-hmm. So now if I run out of something, I'm like, don't be an asshole.
Yeah. Because
then you're like, Pete Holmes is this comedian who talks about, God, how did he word it? It was, I'm participating versus, it becoming a necessity, or no. I'm participating in something versus that thing participating with me. So if he is participating in drinking with friends, it's fine. It's when he's at home about to go to bed and the drinking wants to participate with him. He's like, So he looks at substance as this external thing. And when they want to party with him, he's like, no. That's him recognizing that he's developed an addictive thing towards whatever it is that he's doing, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and that's a good. I like that because it brings me back to that thinking of the control. What can we control? What can't we control? And I think that as working in
You
this.
want to pull that down again? Sorry,
No.
it wiggles up sometimes.
I just need to get taller. No.
Well, that's why I feel bad because some people do that. And I'm like, no, just pull it down.
Pull it down. Just own it. No. But I think of what can we control in those situations. And when you're talking about that baby and it's like, yeah, you get to control kind of the mood that it gives you afterwards. Like, don't let it own you, you know? And that's what I think of when I look back on like substance use or trauma. It's like, don't let it own you. Own it and use it as like a foundation. It doesn't have to be the end all be all, right? You can build a house on the foundation, but if it's not stable enough, then you can't. And so, yeah, that brought me back to that thinking of like, yeah, we get to control how we feel. We don't need the cigarette, even though it is nice, or we don't need the vape, even though it is nice. But so is having caffeine, and so is having $1 million. But, you know, I can't wake up angry every day because I don't have that. Right?
Yeah, that's actually a really great analogy. That because there are people who let that consume them, and that's those people who say, you know, money doesn't bring you happiness. If it took you 70 years to get to $1 million and you sacrificed all this shit to get there, it's the same thing. That's an addiction, and that's the same thing that we do. Having that drink was nice, feeling that buzz was nice because you have nothing to do, but you also could have done all of this other stuff rather than say, oh, I can waste this entire day by, you know, getting high or getting drunk. I could do something with my kids instead.
Yeah.
And that was another interesting thing, like when we talk about owning it. So I didn't think that I could escape my addiction. So I tried hanging myself. And even then, the addict brain in me was like, woof, we've been to a mental health unit before, so we know what to say so that we don't get put on a hold and like all this shit. And it took 8 days for me to, you know, be willing to, or to finally go to treatment, right? So it was just an absolute struggle. And I think a weekend is when I finally said, I introduced myself as an alcoholic at first. And then I was like, oh, I'm addicted to everything. So, so I was like addict alcoholic. So I tell my experience, right? There was a guy who his rock bottom was he was spending less time with his kids. And it just hit him like a ton of bricks. And I was like, dude, that's so minor compared to all of the shit that we've been through. But it's fascinating to go like what's perceived as worth it and what's detriment. Like that just blew me away to hear him be like, I missed my kid's football game. And I was like, you got a problem. I was like, wow, that's it. If my kids were in high school, I would have missed all of the football games. Like it's just wild.
Yeah. And it's so interesting to know.
Oh, the point I was trying to make, I forgot what I was trying to say, was that like, that was like, it's interesting how someone can own it that much faster than somebody like me who it took almost dying for it to even get close to connecting, but somebody can go, oh, look at that. Look at what you just missed out on. What was the thing that made you miss out on that?
But that's what's so interesting to see how we can all we can have a similar experience, and that's that addiction, right? But our difference in how we got there is so different. Like it took him missing out on the football game, but it took, you know, going to the hospital for a year, almost dying to recognize it. And it's all with the mental health, right? And it's all, there's little pieces and they're never not going to be the same. And so when we try to do this size fits all treatment too, it's like, oh, that doesn't work that way, right? Because homeboy that missed out on his kid's football game, he might not have the same mental health that you have. And so why would we ever try to make it all the same?
That's when the facility should look at themselves and be like, oh, he did it because he could afford it. And that shouldn't be why we're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
This guy shouldn't be like, oh, because I can buy my way in, I should take a spot. Because like it was by like super luck that I even got in.
Mm-hmm.
Normally it was like a 6-week wait or something like that. So the fact that I got in, I went straight from the hospital. I spent one night at home and then went to Hazelden. So there are people on this waiting list that really fucking need it. There's a lot missing that are in these walls. And this guy was just like, I'll just buy my way in because I missed a football game.
Mm-hmm.
It's fucking crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
that's my bias jumping in again against rich people.
But hey, that's okay. That's okay. You can see it. That awareness. We're going back to the awareness. No, but, and when I think about that too, is like, it could have been extremely detrimental to him too, like missing a football game. Cause in the past he, that's all he lived and breathed for. Right. But I kind of go back to thinking of his mental health and how it's presenting is probably not the same as your mental health. And so I think what those facilities do miss out on is looking at like, how do we kind of individualize certain treatments, and how do we, for someone who has a difference, because I also think sometimes like people try to like one up each other. It's like, whose war story is better than the other?
Yeah.
Oh my God. And it's
like, I tried telling people like threshold. Mm-hmm. Everybody's threshold is different.
Yeah.
And like I just interviewed somebody who I was asking them about trauma because they were diagnosed with bipolar. They bounced around potentials of is it bipolar schizophrenic?
Like with the diagnosis?
Yeah.
Like, yep.
So they weren't sure if they were going to go with just bipolar or if it was bipolar schizophrenic. So it was complicated history. And I asked him what his first experience, like traumatic experience was. Mm-hmm. And he recalled being 9 years old and finding out that other 9-year-olds worked in sweatshops. Mm-hmm. And he was like, but I don't know if that's trauma. And I was like, well, if you're a 9-year-old and it hits you the right way and you try to comprehend it to its fullest, absolutely that can be traumatic, because then the walls start to close in and you're like, I could end up in a sweatshop. Mm-hmm. I could not see my family again, like these horrible things for sure. Mm-hmm. So that, yeah. So I make fun of that dude who like his thing didn't seem as bad as mine. Yeah. But then like you're saying, I go, if his threshold, if that was the breaking point for him, then yeah, it must have been insanely important, the time that he spent with his family.
Mm-hmm. And like I think of an individual who I think we miss out on like the trauma pieces, I guess, if I get real nitty gritty with it, because we all try to label trauma as PTSD. If you look at PTSD, my mom didn't think I had PTSD because I wasn't a war veteran.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, fuck.
Like people hear trigger warning and they think it's like this snowflake thing.
Yeah.
Trigger warnings existed way before that. Like it just, now that we understand mental health more, we realize that it doesn't apply to somebody like slamming their car door and it triggering like a bomb exploding. Yeah. It applies to so many things. Yeah. A smell, a song. There's so much shit.
Yeah. And like my biggest thing is how people approach. And if I recognize that an argument is ensuing, that can like heighten some of my responses of like, I'll immediately like get tense and I'll like kind of just shut off. And at work, it is so extremely difficult because if there is that approach and you have an angry client, it's really putting those things into place of like, okay, I'm at work. This is okay. This, I am here to help this person, and really implementing those right in that moment. Because if I shut down, the client might not shut down. And so then what does that create? It creates some of that unsafe environment. Yeah. And so,
well, and if the client loses faith in a professional, like when you start to waver, and that can look different for everybody. Like if it's a trigger warning for you, Because, yeah, a lot of us still, and this is whether you're an addict or not, because in the mental health field, people who have been through that a lot, they start to, like I was saying, like, okay, I've been on a mental health unit, so I know how to not get put on a hold.
Yeah.
So as long as I don't admit that I tried to kill myself, as long as I don't admit these things, then I can go home and then we'll just repeat the cycle. Kids recognize that shit too. And they go, okay, my parents made me go here. How did I get here? And how do I like trick these people into thinking that I can go home? Man, it's like how they say dogs can smell fear or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's what is also kind of makes me super amped up, excited wise, because as a therapist, it's like we have to be able to like remain in the moment despite all the chaos that's going around internally and externally. And I always have a good chuckle when a client's like, oh, you're just here for the money. And it's like, I was like, damn, I wish, like,
I've been pushing off this oil change for like 3 months.
Yeah. If only you knew. Ramen for dinner. But, it's like nobody wants to go to work and is told by somebody that they're trying to help that they are like a piece of crap or that they're this awful person. And it's just so interesting because I'm like, oh man, like no amount of money can make me want to do this, but it's because I want to. It's because I'm passionate about this, that I want to be able to help you. And that's why that trauma piece for myself and learning more about it is just so interesting too, because it is a lot to be able to kind of stay in that moment and talk about it, own it, and keep going, not waver. Or even talking about it with a client, because I know sometimes we can be like, ooh, do we talk about this? Do we not talk about this? And so as a professional and at the beginning of all this, that was that professional hat that I had on. I'm like, God, do I talk about this during this time? Do I not? Do I? And then also like, well, my parents don't really know that I'm talking about this. So is that okay? Okay, let's just take it all off and let's dive into that shit. And
it's funny that I found, like, I don't know why, but swearing disarms people really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because every wedding that I shot, there wasn't a single wedding where I didn't make some type of joke that would throw people off or swear in a situation that, like, somebody has a baby. I'm like, oh my God, that baby's so fucking cute. And like, you don't expect that that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But it lets people's guard down so that they can be like, oh, I don't have to be something that I'm not in front of this guy. He clearly doesn't give a fuck.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to do that in here too, to be like, I don't dress up. I appreciate people that do come and dress up, but I don't dress up on purpose.
Yeah.
Do you remember have you ever heard of Dr. Meany?
No.
He was that that doctor. He was a psychiatrist on the mental health unit in St. Cloud, who was using his position to sexually assault clients.
Oh, yes. He was. Now I remember the article. There was an article.
So I had to meet with that guy before all this stuff came out. And he was insanely well dressed.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't help myself. I was like, why? Everybody else is wearing scrubs. You're the only one that's wearing like this really clearly expensive suit.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, well, he read some article where it's like it gives a clear separation. Oh. It's like, why would you want to do that especially if you're a psychologist?
Yeah.
Like, sure, you want to wear like a white shirt and tie.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. That's it's a clear separation, but it doesn't make you completely terrified of this person.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas your name is Dr. Meany. Mm-hmm. Already people are like, is this a joke?
Mm-hmm.
Second, and then you want to do this shit and you're fine with it making you look like he recognized this thing and wanted that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you want that? So from that experience and from wanting to make sure that people don't feel like they have to be afraid to say things, because I'm on your team.
Yeah.
Like, I want to look like everybody else to make sure that people realize that the shit that happens can happen to anybody.
Yeah.
And that it doesn't mean that you have to, if you're going to share your story, it doesn't mean that you have to change and be presentable.
Mm-hmm.
Live it the way, like, tell it the way that you lived it,
Mm-hmm.
so that people can continue to relate. You're doing a fantastic job, by the way.
Well, thank you. But it's like, but being able to, like, and that's like the crazy thing about a professional is like being able to take that hat off and be like, yeah, this is some real shit. Because, and in those, with working with clients, it's being able to relate to them. And I always think of like boundaries are so fluid. So like the doctor clearly wanted to keep that boundary there. But I think of, okay, what is that?
Make sure you're pointed at the mic still. Sorry.
No, I should just take it off and start walking. But I think of when, like, I talk to a client, I want them to be able to be in a safe spot. And oftentimes a room, like how you talked about this room, you know, you wanted it to feel like comforting, opening, and welcoming. And I think of, my primary job is working in a secured environment. And so there's lots of metal, lots of dry, like it's not very warm and inviting. And so for myself, I mean, today is not really a great day, but I wear a lot of bright colors.
Okay.
You know, today I came straight from work and I was a little bit more professional.
Well, and I think subconsciously, because like I said, you're not the first person to feel like they, you know, and whether that's subconscious or not, where you're like, okay, I have important things that I want to talk about. I'm excited to talk about these things.
Yeah.
I need to look like what I'm going to say.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if people have that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, that makes
I'm not trying to dissect you or anything. This is why I could never be a therapist. Like, every instance that I've been in, somebody is always like, you should look into being a therapist if you're like this knowledgeable and involved in whatever. It's like, if I did that, then I would have to respect those boundaries and I would have to wear those hats. Whereas if I do this, I can make dick jokes and
yes,
still be able to help people. Like,
yeah,
I don't think those things, I mean, obviously I'm not making dick jokes for everybody, but like doing things that just are like help disarm people so that they don't have to feel like they need to protect something.
Yes. And that makes so much sense. And it's what we do. And it's something that, you know, as you have shared, that's what you like to do. And that's something that I like to do. And being able to take those hats off and with coming in here and having that like, ooh, okay, I didn't really think about this. Are we going to go into this? And it's like, no, wait, Jessica, it's okay to take the hat off. And like, you were so relaxed and like, hey, no, let's talk about this. And I'm like, okay, fuck the hat. I'm sorry. Let's burn it now. It's like, I don't have to like do that. And that's why it is so nice, but annoying, as I said, that I have a partner too, that really enjoys this too. I know, but going back to him too. Right. But also here too, to have that relaxedness and to have that, hey, we're all in this together. You're not by yourself. And so that's why it's when I hear, going back to your other thing too, when I hear a professional, especially in the mental health field, say, well, I do this to separate you and me. I'm like, ooh, talk about safe. You know, I go back to safe and I'm like, that's why, you know, my tattoos, I have no issues with talking about them because it's like, that's a fucking great conversation starter because half the time I don't even know what I'm talking about. So why not? Like that creates that humanistic thing in people. And
are you allowed to have your septum piercing in at work?
Yep.
I think that's a big thing too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I don't know why, but for me, I've never met somebody with a septum piercing that I was like afraid of. So I don't know if it's like that little thing is disarming too for people to go, oh, that looks cool.
Yeah.
Because then internally they're like, I've always wanted to get my septum pierced.
Right. This person's cool and inviting. Right. They have poked themselves. No. They understand. No. But I totally get it. And I've always it's always interesting because when I started going to therapy myself, I always kind of like I always hoped that my like therapist had some like either a piercing or a tattoo, because it's like, you get me. And it's just so more relaxed, and even if they don't, the way that they carry themselves, the way that they talk. Because I remember when I was younger going to my first therapist, and he was just so like monotone, dry, and I'm like, I'm about to like cry to you, and you're showing me no emotion. Like, what? And so that's a big thing for me too. As I am dramatic, get loud, bring in those real life experiences, because I think it's so important. Bring that human side into therapy, because when we look at it all and going back to the beginning, people feel alone. People go to therapy because they sometimes want therapy or sometimes they don't, and they have to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of that initial thing is you feel very alone. And so it goes on to me to say, hey, what do you want to talk about today?
Mm-hmm.
So
when it comes to boundaries, and because Kim has explained this to me, like why I would be a terrible therapist because I have no boundaries, which I that's fine. I accept that. But because you need those boundaries to keep you and the client safe. Mm-hmm. The thing that I can't help but do this because of, I don't know if it's an analytical brain or just like I just debate. I love debate stuff. So when I hear a thing, I'm like, well, what's the other side of the thing? So if the boundaries help keep you and the client safe, those clients still commit suicide sometimes. Mm. So if there's a negative outcome, that's a possibility either which way. You could have the most positive experience with this person, and then next week, unfortunately, they're gone. Mm-hmm. If for some reason you letting down those walls and not having to have those boundaries made it so that they connected with you, and then that thing didn't, does that make sense? Like, mm-hmm. if you're accepting that there's a potential for a negative outcome either way, mm-hmm. for me, I go, I'd rather take the negative outcome where I opened up to make sure that they knew that we were equal in that sense.
Yeah.
That's like always my approach. Mm-hmm. Some people say that like I overshare and I'm too much this or that. It's like, mm-hmm. that's the only way that I can make sure that I'm conveying sincerity, mm-hmm. which is the main point of this podcast.
Yeah.
You can't it's difficult to convey sincerity, mm-hmm. when you have these certain restrictions, mm-hmm. right? So, like most people that go into mental health want to convey that sincerity because mm-hmm. they really want you to feel better.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's so I applaud people who are able to do that with the boundaries. It's super difficult.
Yeah. And it can carry over, like kind of talking about, it can carry over into those conversations. And when we talk about certain things, it's like, ooh, do I go there or do I not go there? And then getting that permission to go there, it's like, all right, let's fucking go there. Like, I'm not at work, I can do this. And then I also think of the flip side, because what kind of came to mind with boundaries is like when we are totally out of just wanting to talk. And I think of the podcast that you had with Sarah. Mm. The too much peopling.
Yes, I was going to say.
I was like, yes.
So good. I peopled too much today.
Yes, I peopled too much. And kind of going back to when I get home and like I have 4 dogs and it's like, I peopled too much today. But I love my dogs, so come here. And I think of with my boyfriend loving like psychology, he always wants to talk about it. And I'm like, what? You're just like,
yeah. Dude, Kim, like I'll bring up like, because it's hard, she's been doing it for so long. She'll say this kid was just naughty, mm-hmm. and I'll go, well, what behaviors were they exhibiting? Mm-hmm. And she'll be like, no, they were naughty. I was like, okay, well, why were they there then? And then she'll be like, okay, so they might have this and that, and it's like, I know that it sucks, and I get like the not mundane, but like you do it so much that you're like, do you really need to be here, or are you just being a shit kid? Like, it's hard to discern that stuff sometimes.
Yeah.
Because you see it so often.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the benefit that me and your boyfriend have, is that we're not there every day.
Yeah.
So the interactions that we get to have, that's another thing that I recognize too. Is like, I don't have to do this all the time. So when I do it, I'm also able to give, I don't know, I'm the Robin Hood of mental health.
Yeah. But it's good though, because then it elicits us, or, you know, the people that do work in the field, like it gets that passion burning back again too, because we can get really complacent. We can get really like, oh yeah, I'm going to work today. I'm going to help this person. Like, just pull your shit together. You know, like some days you just want to do that, but it's like, but then having these conversations with the Robin Hoods of mental health, it's like, oh yeah, fuck yeah, that's why I like this. This is why I do this. You know, like I don't always have to be a professional. I don't have to be a robot. We can, you know, stomp on the hat that I had, light it on fire. But then also recognizing like we can take a break too. Because I think that even as Robin Hood, he needed a break too.
Oh, for sure.
And so I think then it goes into that self-care, you know, as a therapist, like, fuck, what is that? Finding those things. And it goes
your support system, right?
Yes, which ties directly right back to, you know, addiction, like having all that stuff. And also recognizing that, I mean, when I think about it, alcohol, meth, heroin, all of those things, when used in the quantities that they get used in, your brain starts to create a high level of any type of serotonin, dopamine, all those fun little things.
Mm-hmm.
It is not natural and not common. And so when we get to that point of sobriety and maintaining our sobriety, I think sometimes the programs miss of you're never going to be or get the feeling that you had when you were high. But you can you can bring things like I see guitars. You know, you're going to feel like, yeah, this feels good. I like this. But it's never going to quite be like your best high, because that best high was unnatural. You know,
right.
Your body didn't naturally produce that. And I think that leads into a lot of relapses and lapses, is we're not getting that rush. And it's like, nothing in my mind is going to give me that anymore. So it's why you see those cross addictions, gambling, shopping, my strange addiction. But, you know, you see some of those because we're trying to replace it. And it's like, no, wait a second. You're not going to. You're never going to.
Yeah. That's not a lot of people like that I say this, but I say that sobriety is a curse, mm-hmm. in the sense that you had like magical powers of being able to, like you said, you know, that unnatural amount of dopamine or serotonin or whatever. And then when you're sober, you are able to look back on that stuff and go, oh man, I know what that felt like. I remember. And then you look at everybody else who gets to use responsibly, mm-hmm. and you're like, man, it sucks that I couldn't be like that because of what I know that it does. Now I know too much.
Yeah. Damn it. No. But that's good though. Like knowing too much. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, a friend of mine said, so I had said that knowledge is a curse. And he said, no, it's only a curse if you choose to do nothing with it. Mm-hmm. I was like, fuck. Absolutely right. Because now, mm-hmm. if I'm saying sobriety is a curse and knowledge is a curse, it's like self-pity.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, woe is me because I remember what it was like to use and I wish I could get fucked up again. And mm-hmm. it's like, well, accept it, go ahead and mourn it, and then move on. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, okay. I think, God, we have gone on way too long.
Have we? Oh, there's no clock in here. See, that's the problem. As you know,
well, I could go on forever and ever. So we definitely need to have you back. Thank you so much for doing this. Oh, and text me a childhood photo when you get a chance.
Yes, absolutely.
But do you have any advice for, I guess, because I don't touch on this enough, which is the parents' side of things. Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for parents who are going through that right now? Is that...
Yeah, like going through kind of whatever it may be, you know, with their child, mental health, addiction. It's really about being okay with not having that control, and being okay with this doesn't mean that you're a bad parent. I think I always want to go back to that, is this moment, this experience does not define who you are as a parent. Moving forward is what will help you grow as a parent. You know, are you going to be there for your child? Are you going to be supportive of your child? Those next steps. So, yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. For anybody, because a lot of therapists are booked out quite a ways, and it's unfortunate. Definitely our code is still active. You can save 10% by going to betterhelp.com/DDGD. Even if we weren't sponsored by them, the availability that they have is still so insanely useful. You can talk to somebody really quickly. I think it's within 24 hours. So whether that code works or not, or for how long it works, I don't know when you're going to be listening to this, but betterhelp.com is a huge resource if you're looking to seek help. They actually have LADCs now, which is very cool. If you're looking for that immediate help, because we live in a society where we want it now.
Yeah.
It's tough to think about, 3 weeks from now, holding all of this stuff in before I can talk to somebody. So betterhelp.com is a massive resource. If you want to save 10% on your first month, DDGD. I feel gross for saying that, but it is something that is insanely helpful. Thank you again for being here. And to the listeners, be well.